Chapter 3: A National Tug of War. The powers of the national government were increasing, and the slave states feared that the government might use those powers to destroy slavery. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had set up the Out-of-State Plan. It also prohibited slavery in all the new states that would be carved from the territory northwest of the Ohio River. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase added lands as large as the whole area of the original 13 states, and nervous Southern slave owners had more reason than ever to be fearful. What would happen when those lands were sliced up into new states? Would those states also be set up under a law that forbade slavery? If that should happen, then the slave states, the very states that had once dominated the Union, would become only a small minority, and then the national government in Washington would no longer understand the South and its problems. It might even launch a crusade against slavery and destroy the peculiar institution. Southern politicians decided there was only one way to avoid this danger. They had to ensure that whenever the federal government carved one new state out of the West, it always paired that state with another. One of the new states would be a slave and the other free. One would permit slaves and the other would not. If the national government could follow this policy, then it would not matter how unevenly the population grew. Nor would it matter how many more congressmen the North might have in the House. In the Senate, where each state had 2 votes, no more and no less, slave states would be able to block any threatening laws. In this way, the South could actually use the Out-of-State Plan to preserve slavery. The story of how new states were added in the early 1800s reads like a tug of war. Each side added one whenever the opposite side added one. By the end of 1819, there were 22 states in the Union, and the sides were precisely even, 11 slave states against 11 free. The population of the whole country had grown to nearly 10 million. Since the North was growing faster than the South, there were about 500,000 more people in the North. This meant that in the House of Representatives, the North had 105 members against only 81 for the South. But in the Senate, of course, the 2 sides were still even. When the territory of Missouri applied to Congress for statehood in 1819, the South held its breath and prepared for its first great struggle to defend slavery. Louisiana, admitted as a state in 1812, had been the first one carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. But Louisiana, where slavery had long existed, was plainly Southern. There was no question about it being a slave state. Missouri, however, was quite another matter, for Missouri was located squarely in the middle, halfway between the northern and the southern boundaries of the newly purchased West. Was Missouri to be a slave or free? Some of the bitterest debates over slavery occurred in the House of Representatives. Samuel F.B. Morse painted a representation of the House in 1822. Besides being a notable artist, Morse is the man who invented the telegraph and the Morse code. Check it out on YouTube. In Congress, then, the battle lines were drawn. Some Southerners already believed that they were in a life-and-death struggle. If they let Missouri go free, the Union would surely be flooded by still more and more free states. Then, it was only a question of time until the national government would abolish slavery everywhere. A new bitterness entered the halls of Congress. Northern congressmen argued that to allow slavery into the West would be a national disgrace. As the debate went on, it simply confirmed the fears of Southerners that the free states were out to destroy slavery, and with it, the South. Congress passed the Missouri Compromise in 1820 after a whole year of debate. But it was not so much a compromise as a stalemate. The compromise followed the rules of the North-South tug-of-war that had been going on for at least 20 years. Each side added one state to its team. Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state, while to balance it, they admitted Maine as a free state. At the same time, they drew a line through the rest of the Louisiana Purchase at 36 degrees 30 latitude. It extended the southern boundary of Missouri and declared that no one would be permitted to own slaves north of that line. Although people at the time called it a compromise, it was not really like the compromises the framers of the Constitution made in 1787. For example, think of the compromises between the large and small states that created the House of Representatives with its proportional representation and the Senate with its equal representation. Those earlier compromises gave each side part of what it wanted, but slavery was a different kind of question. When it came to slavery, both sides felt it was all or nothing, and both sides were simply biding their time. Far-sighted men saw that the Missouri Compromise was nothing more than a truce. It kept the sides from going to war, but it also announced an upcoming fight to the finish. Aged Thomas Jefferson was sad. "The compromise," he said, "was a fire bell in the night, the death knell of the Union." John Quincy Adams saw it as a title page to a great tragic volume. If the nation had been growing and moving west a bit slower, the truce between North and South might have lasted longer. But it was growing quickly, and it was moving west very rapidly. The next crisis came over Texas. Stephen Austin started an American settlement in Texas and in Tejas, Mexico, the year after the Missouri Compromise. He was so successful that he soon attracted thousands of immigrants from the United States to settle in this Mexican territory. Austin was born in Virginia. He attended college in Kentucky and had lived in Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. He had run a store, directed a bank, edited a newspaper, and served as an officer in the militia. He was a good-natured dictator, and he was a pro-slavery man. He owned slaves. He brought slaves into Tejas, what was the Americans settlers were now calling Texas, and he was determined to protect slavery in his new settlement. So when the Mexican authorities said that slavery was to be abolished in Mexico, and when it became clear that they intended to enforce their law, Austin led a revolt. In 1836, the American settlers in Texas declared their independence from Mexico, and they claimed control over the portions of the Mexican states of Nuevo Mexico, Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Tamaulipas that had never been part of Texas. The Mexican government lacked the power to stop these Texans from leaving Mexico or from claiming to own the additional territory they claimed. So Texas became an independent country settled and run by people from the United States, and it seemed obvious to most Americans that it was only a matter of time before the Texans would ask to join the Union. The new Republic of Texas was so big there was no telling how many new states someone might carve from her territory. But there was no question that Texas was slave country. It was not surprising, then, that when the people of Texas asked to become part of the United States, Northern congressmen voted it down. Texas, they said, was nothing but a slave owner's clever plot to smuggle a lot of new slaves into the Union. For years, the northern states managed to keep Texas out of the Union, but Texas drew the country's energy away from all other questions. In the time of the presidential election of 1844, the Texas question was more alive than ever. The popular desire for compromise was so great that the Democratic Party actually refused to nominate their best-known leader, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren had already been president once, but he had said he was against annexing Texas. Instead of Van Buren, then, for the first time in American history, a party nominated a dark horse, a man not known in the nation as a whole and someone whom few had imagined could make a good candidate. The man was James K. Polk. He had once served as governor of Tennessee, and he was a loyal Democrat. The Whigs ran Henry Clay as their candidate. Clay was famous, and the Whigs ridiculed the Democrats for choosing a man who was unknown. It happened that earlier that year, the polka had become the most popular dance in Washington. "The polka dance will now be the order of the day," said the Whigs. "It means 2 steps backward for 1 in advance." But the Whigs were wrong, and Polk carried the day. Polk had a formula for compromise. His word, expansion, to annex Texas all by itself seemed a menace, at least to the north, but the Oregon Territory stretched far up into the northwest. The United States had been sharing the Oregon Territory with Great Britain. If at the same time you annexed Texas, you also annexed the Oregon Territory. You would then have something to give the North in return. That was Polk's platform. Expand everywhere at once. Then there would be something for everybody. Besides, the very thought of stretching the nation all the way to the Pacific was exhilarating. Perhaps the nation could be united simply by marching westward together. In a divided nation, growth can be a kind of compromise. And so it happened. In 1845, the United States finally admitted Texas as a state of the Union. The agreement by which Texas joined the Union provided that no more than 4 additional states would ever be carved from her territory. Moreover, the Missouri Compromise line would extend over Texas. That gave something to the South. It ensured that the South would have more territory they could potentially turn into slave states. Later that year, living up to his campaign promise, Polk claimed for the United States the Oregon Territory. That was something for the North. Polk at first demanded a stretch of land that reached all the way up to the borders of Alaska, then owned by Russia, but he finally settled on the 49th parallel, the northern boundary of the United States territories immediately to the east. Now both North and South had gained large territories. New states in the West would eventually add to the strength of both sides. But many people wanted to quiet the conflict between North and South. For them, Polk's program created problems. Even though Mexico had not been able to defeat the Texas rebels when they declared their independence, Mexico still viewed the Texas territory as part of its own, and so it viewed the United States annexation of Texas to be an act of war. Meanwhile, a new trouble spot had developed in California. California, at the time, was part of Mexico. But settlers from the United States were beginning to move into California, and the Mexican government wanted to keep all Americans out of California. They were afraid California would go the way of Texas, so Mexico threatened war. Northerners, however, feared that the United States would defeat Mexico, and the victory would give more territory to Southern slaveholders. The United States would have even more slave states. It was only over Northern opposition then that Polk led the United States into war against Mexico, and in 1848, the United States forces captured Mexico City. The helpless Mexican government then gave up all claims to Texas. It agreed that Texas belonged to the United States, but that was only the start. Before the war, Mexico had owned all the land in the far west that reached up to Oregon from the Mexican border of today. Mexico also owned all the lands between the Pacific Ocean and Texas. Mexico now handed all that territory over to the victorious United States. In other words, they handed over the territory of the present states of California, Nevada, Utah, and most of Arizona, and large portions of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming as well. These lands including Texas, were larger than the whole Louisiana Purchase or all the original United States when the Constitution was adopted. This should have satisfied any American's yen for expansion. Yet when President Polk asked the Senate to approve the Mexican treaty that gave the United States all this territory, a dozen senators voted against it. Why? Because they wanted to annex all of Mexico. Still, the treaty passed. But it took no prophet to predict that the more western lands spelled more trouble. Every new acre was a new subject for a debate, or rather, for a quarrel. Southerners did not bother to study whether these new lands were really places where slavery and the plantation system would flourish. They were thinking only about spreading slave power. In the bitterly divided nation, every stroke of national good luck became a new cause of discontent. Each section was afraid the other would somehow gain more. By an astonishing coincidence, gold was discovered in California in the very same year Mexico handed over California to the United States. American gold rushers flocked to California by the tens of thousands. These people, too, would soon want to come into the Union as a state, but in 1849 there were 30 states, and the national scorecard showed 15 slave states against 15 free. To admit the state of California, as people requested in 1850, would break the tie. How long could the National Balancing Act go on? The United States was now stretched from ocean to ocean. It had largely settled all its possible boundary disputes on the north and the south with Canada and Mexico. There was no more room to settle the slavery issue by promising neighboring territory to the north or to the south. Now the conflict had to take place inside the established boundaries of the nation. Early in 1850, more fear and hate than ever charged the air when the Senate met to decide the future of the territories taken from Mexico. Senator Calhoun from South Carolina made impossible demands. He actually prepared a constitutional amendment intended to provide for the election of two presidents, one from the slave states and one from the free. Senator Seward of New York called all compromise essentially vicious and refused even to appeal to the Constitution. He preferred a higher law. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky led the forces of conciliation. He had a plan. By nature a compromiser, he had the half-hearted support of many people, but the enthusiasm of very few. The nation had 3 times defeated Clay for president, yet he sponsored the bundle of laws that later became the Compromise of 1850. He offered something for everybody, but left the main question unanswered. Let's admit California as a free state, he said. That, he figured, was a boon to the North. Then he said, let's create a strong Fugitive Slave Act to protect the rights of Southern slave owners. Slave owners should have the right to recapture their property, slaves who run away to the North. So that would be a boon to the South. Then Clay went on, let's abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia, where the city of Washington is located. Something for the North. But let us permit slavery still to exist in Washington. Something for the South. Clay never tried to answer the biggest question, whether all the rest of the new areas taken from Mexico should be free or slave. His compromise postponed the answer. He proposed that the people of those states should in the future decide that question for themselves when they applied to join the Union. Those who admired Clay's scheme called this last idea popular sovereignty. Those who disliked this proposal called it squatter sovereignty. And this matter of sovereignty held the seeds of war. Short-sighted optimists called this a final settlement, but a second look showed that it only put off the evil day. As usual in the years before a war, each side accused the other of acts of aggression. Both sides were right. Both freedom and slavery were aggressive. The champions of each rightly believed that each must expand or die. Pro-slavery forces in the South would not leave well enough alone. They had lost California, but that simply stirred them to push harder on the next round. The next round came sooner than most people expected. In 1854, people had been moving into the lands of the North left over from the Louisiana Purchase. It was time for these areas to become territories, so they could eventually become states. The question was, would they be free or slave? Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois took the lead. He argued that it was best for Congress to refuse to answer the most difficult question. He argued that the idea of popular sovereignty should extend even into those northern regions. Let the people who actually live in these territories, when they apply to become states, decide whether their state should be slave or free. Let them decide the question democratically. Douglas was a clever politician. After months of debate, he managed to get his Kansas-Nebraska bill passed in 1854. It seemed to keep an even balance between slave and free by allowing future new states to decide for themselves, but in truth it was a great victory for the South, for the whole Kansas-Nebraska territory was north of the old freedom line drawn in the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. Popular sovereignty now opened those lands to the possibility of becoming slave states. If Senator Douglas thought his plan would somehow settle the slavery issue and hold the Union together, he was soon proven wrong. His Kansas-Nebraska Act aroused a strong new political force. Its members called themselves the Republican Party, and they organized themselves in 1854, the same year that Douglas Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. The new party drew together people who opposed allowing slavery into the New West. Senator Douglas had simply marked off a new battleground. This was no longer a battleground of words. New Englanders formed immigrant aid societies and collected money to send large numbers of anti-slavery people into Kansas to ensure it became a free state. Southerners sent in their pro-slavery settlers. Popular sovereignty became an invitation to civil war. By mid-1856, American citizens in Kansas were killing one another over slavery. On May 21st, pro-slavery forces led by the Southern Colonel Jefferson Buford and his Kickapoo Rangers captured, sacked, and burned the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. Then John Brown took revenge with 4 of his sons and other anti-slavery men. Brown believed God had sent him to destroy slavery and slave owners, and with that sense of righteous authority, he and his friends hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death in what became known as the Potawatomi Massacre. Clearly, the Congress of the United States could no longer ignore the central issue. By the time the Congress considered the question of whether to admit Kansas as a state, there was not one Kansas government. There were 2, one anti-slavery and the other pro-slavery. Each claimed to be the true and only government of Kansas. Congress eventually admitted Kansas as a free state in 1861, but by then, the whole nation was preparing for war. Back in 1856, no one was sure whether Kansas would be free or slave, but everyone called it Bleeding Kansas. The spirit of violence reached into the very halls of the Senate. While Congress was debating the Kansas issue, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts used every insulting word he could demand to attack the South and several of its senators. Representative Preston S. Brooks of South Carolina was the nephew of one of the senators whom Sumner insulted. Brooks took it upon himself to avenge the honor of the South, and he did so not with words, but with a cane. On May 22, 1856, he came up to Senator Sumner while Sumner was sitting in the Senate chamber. Brooks used his cane to beat Sumner until he lay on the floor unconscious. Brooks was re-elected by his constituency and became a Southern hero. Senator Sumner, meanwhile, never regained his health, and Sumner became a Northern martyr. For several years, his empty seat in the Senate served as a vivid symbol that many Northern and Southern leaders would no longer speak to one another. We can be misled rather easily if we think that the years from 1820 to 1860 were years of compromise. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, none of these were truly a compromise. Each was a truce in a war to the death. The issue was not finally to be settled by words and votes. The fate of slavery was eventually settled on the battlefield.